So my name is Stephanie Arnott. I'm from the University of Ottawa, and my esteemed colleague Micah Varnica from the University of British Columbia, and others on the research team who conducted a bit of research in the last couple of years about FSL teacher education are really happy to welcome everybody that's here and everybody who might be listening on the recording after the fact to our fourth research exchange, which is meant to use the findings from this project as a springboard for discussion, broader discussion about FSL teacher or language teacher development, and also professional learning. So we are ecstatic today to welcome Sarah Mercer from the University of Graz. But before I introduce her, I wanted to do two things. Firstly, I wanted to invite the people who are here to put in the chat where you're joining us from in the world right now, and then also your role in language education, whether it be FSL or other, just to give Sarah a sense of who would be joining us. She asked me several times, and I said, I actually don't know until it happens. So it would be great to know that. Aussi, on va gérer la discussion pour la plupart en anglais. So most of the discussion will happen in English for today. Mais si vous avez des questions en français, n'hésitez pas de les mettre dans le chat et comme ça, on peut les traduire et on peut continuer la discussion d'une façon plurilingue in French and in English, and we'll do our best to facilitate. The second thing I want to do is to clarify and I've done this at the beginning of each exchange, what we mean by exchange. Sometimes we come to these sessions and we get to, as Philippa said, and she rightly said, sit back, enjoy, listen, and that is certainly part of it. But we definitely welcome the exchange sort of dimension of it. So the first exchange that will happen will be between Sarah and myself and Micah and those in the chat, just to sort of get her expert take on our fourth gap related to the relationality of language teaching and individuality relationality piece that came out of the data. But also, so in that first part, we encourage you to listen, and we welcome questions in the chat for Sarah and for just generally speaking. And then halfway, we're going to open it up to a format of Q&A and bring you into the exchange with your questions, but also our final question related to what researchers should be asking in this regard. So it is about listening and thinking together, but it's really about pushing our thinking together on this issue and on the broader issue of FSL teacher education in Canada, certainly. This is a chance for you to voice a question that might have been you've been asking yourself for a long time, or perhaps during the session itself. So who is Sarah Mercer? If you're asking yourself this question, then let me tell you, she is a wonderful human from the University of Graz, professor of foreign language teaching, head of English language teaching methodology there. Obviously, if you've encountered her research, she studies all things, all aspects of the psychology of language learning. And keywords that keep coming up that I feel are relevant to this discussion in her research and expertise are things like affect, motivation, well-being for sure, among many others, but certainly in relation to this topic, those are three that sort of stick related to teachers. She encompasses many roles, including researcher, teacher, service, person or in service, as we all are in academia, and also ambassador. I loved that one. I thought that's a good one, but you ambassador for lots of things. She really has, in my estimation, having attended many of her talks and spoken with her recently, been someone who's turned passion into advocacy, which I really love and admire and is inspiring for me personally. So we're really thrilled to have Sarah with us, and I'm going to hand it over to her with sort of a preface of this first question. Obviously, she's also going to introduce herself if, in addition to what I just mentioned, but Sarah's had a chance to read about Gap 4 related to the relationality as this idea of going beyond the individual in teacher ed and teacher development. And so how are you thinking about the gap as you've read it in the research, but also where your thinking is at generally about this topic? So we can start there. Go ahead.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for asking me to join you, and thank you both for your incredible patience with me faffing about over the couple of weeks. It's been so difficult, so thank you for your patience. It's lovely to be here. It was great to read the report and read the perspective, particularly on mentorship, partly from a selfish point of view, in that we are having problems with that topic here at my own institution. So there was a kind of, it really resonated with some of the issues that we're facing here, in that we have got no formalized process of mentorship. We don't have any quality controls on mentorship. There's no training for mentors. There's not even proper reimbursement for it financially. And yet our whole teacher education system depends on mentors. So there's a complete oddness about it in that we've set up a system that absolutely, utterly depends on mentorship in schools, and yet we don't actually give them any training, any support, any recognition, or any kind of proper structure to the whole mentorship program, apart from in terms of, somebody needs to do it. So this resonated in that this is something that we are struggling with in our institution, and it's to do with resources, and it's to do with money, and it's to do with structures, and it's to do with financial priorities, and it's to do with a mismatch between what we know would be helpful and the people running the system, quite simply, who don't necessarily, for various reasons, want to actually actively support that. It's So okay, so that's why it resonated a lot on a very practical level, because we're having some issues here with our mentorship. I think for those of you who have got an interest in kind of sort of some of the theory, is I became interested in complexity theory a few years ago. And one of the things I have always said is that if you are a teacher in the classroom, complexity theory appeals to you intuitively. It's always positioned as being this kind of high abstracted theory. And I think sometimes the way it's talked about, and I think I've contributed to that problem, is unhelpful. But actually, in fact, it's a very, very practical understanding of what happens in any teaching encounter, in that it is all relational. So complex dynamic system is basically just a series of relationships. And you talk about the dynamism of it, that it changes over time and place, and that you get emergent qualities coming out of that. And I don't know a single teacher who won't tell you that when you go into the classroom, those group dynamics, those relationships in the classroom are absolutely central to whether what you do succeeds or not. And so I think it's actually an intuitively appealing theory. It's just not made very accessible in certain ways that we've talked about it and worked with it, but that perhaps is a different issue. But because I became interested in complexity theory, that's what took me from being interested in the learner to being interested in the teacher. Because as soon as you understand the classroom as a complex dynamic system, you understand that the teacher is the hub of all those relationships. And the teacher has a relationship with every student, and the students have relationships with each other, but the hub, the central hub of all that relational activity in the classroom is the teacher. And then I started to think, okay, well, what do we know about the psychology of teacher? And Stephanie knows that I then became very interested in well-being, and that became something that I have been advocating and talking about, feeling very strongly about that in recent years. And that became because you start to understand that the teacher is the center of all that. And if you're not looking after your teachers, if you're not caring for them, if you're not supporting them, if you're not ensuring that they're in the right place, how can they build those relationships? How can they pass on that positive effect? How can they share that enthusiasm? It's just not realistic. And so that's, yeah, I don't know if Stephanie, if that helps answer how I came through all that story to be interested in teachers, be interested in relationships, and to see basically, I think the relationship is actually the central unit that we should be looking at in research, but we don't have that history. So our history of research is to look at individual variables or individual people.
Right.
So not even to look at, we don't even look at clusters of variables.
Yeah, so that's what I was going to ask you about, because this study looked at two sort of time points or touch points of that professional learning. So I was going to ask you if you're thinking where your thinking's at with respect to teacher education, maybe just even that phase, because it resonates with me in terms of when you enter the field and you're a new teacher or at any point in your career span. But I wonder to what extent that dual identity of developing teacher and student when you're in that that phase, because it did come out in the findings, this idea of what we were finding in the field, to what extent is that being replicated in faculties of education or in preparation venues. So I just didn't, hearing you speak made me think, okay, if teachers are the hub, as you said, of all those relationships, how do we train them to be that when they're there? If maybe we'd focus on professors when it comes to professional learning. And I just, that's what was sort of going in my brain. I didn't know what you might think
Right,
about
so I've
that.
got so many things to say. I don't know where to
That's
take
what
it.
this is about.
Okay,
Just do it.
right.
Yeah.
Okay, so the first thing is professional learning. To what extent that is top down or self-directed. That's the
Mm-hmm.
first big issue in that for me, is that you need to provide the opportunities, you need to provide the resources, you need to provide the time and the money for people to engage in professional learning. But if other people are deciding what you need and you are not deciding yourself what you need in your context, in your situation, there's going to be a problem for your motivation and mismatch, and that's perfectly understandable. So I think there's that whole notion of self-directed learning and the importance of that. And then you come back to what's the person's relationship to their context, to their subject, to the way that they are working. How do they relate to their identity is all about relational work. So I know that Amanda's working on identities as well. So your identity is a big part of that relationship that you build. So identity work is relational. So if you're working through your identity of whether you're a student, whether you're a teacher, whether you're a becoming teacher, if you're teaching different languages, how you relate to different languages, other intersectional identities you have, that's going to be relational work, I would imagine. I don't know if that's what you were getting at.
Yeah, I think so. And I guess I'm just alluding to one of, and again, it's the intersections of all of these pieces of the puzzle, this idea of to what extent are we providing and on what in particular, like you said, self-directed or top-down in at different phases. So when in the study itself talked a lot about mentorship in relation to language proficiency, right? That's a key topic, if you will, of mentorship. And I think the teachers themselves in the study thought a lot about mentorship in terms of feelings of community and well-being and to combat isolation more so than what the system might believe mentorship would be beneficial for. And so that sort of dynamic presented itself at different phases. So not just in when they entered the field, but also in teacher education. So yeah, that's I think where I was coming from.
So in the work that we've also done on well-being is relationships remain central all the way through your career in terms of your well-being, having somebody. So I think maybe this is also about a question of what we understand by mentorship. So I think mentorship, and I did note this in relation to the findings, is seen as something that is beneficial for one person, and it seemed to be like a giving and a receiving, but it's not. You always benefit from being a mentor. I'm engaged in lots of mentorship programs. Also, if you're talking about service, I've been involved in 3, 4, 5, 6 mentorship, no more, if I talk about the ones at conferences. And I benefit hugely from being a mentor. It isn't that, and I think sometimes this notion of mentorship is seen that you are giving something, so what do you get out of it? Maybe we need to conceptualize this more as a bi-directional relationship, and then you see that actually being a mentor is such a rewarding, fulfilling thing to do. Now, admittedly, not everybody might feel like that about it, but I think maybe we need to start helping people to see the benefits of being a mentor, not just receiving mentorship. Maybe that's also part of this relational perspective, that it's seen as a bi-directional thing, that there are benefits to being a mentor, not just receiving good mentorship.
So that could definitely be considered. You've set me up quite nicely for that. And I'm not in a rush here, but that second question of where do we need to push or what's in the way, this idea of even the conceptualization of relationality in terms of how we operationalize it in the educational system as mentorship, right? Like there's also community building. And so I think each of these has different insinuations. And I would assume you would agree with that. The terminology sometimes gets us in trouble.
Yeah, and if we look at our own wording and how we talk about it, we very often talking about a power dynamic in a mentorship, where we're assuming that someone has the knowledge and someone has the power, and they are graciously sharing it with somebody who is in a position of less power. And I think that's fundamentally wrong. I think it can be a much more democratic, equitable thing that also is extremely beneficial for both sides. People share and grow in different ways and different approaches to that. So one of the things that we did with Tammy, who's a colleague of mine, was we took an appreciative inquiry approach to giving feedback. And one of the things that she feels strongly about, I feel less strongly about it, but I feel differently about it, is perhaps the way, is that she deliberately explored the strengths of mentor and mentee beforehand and matched them accordingly. I don't know how it works in your setting, but in my setting, it's completely random. It's who's available at the school and what school they're going to. And there's no sense that, I'm not wanting this to sound like a dating agency, but common sense should tell us that
Speed dating mentorship. I like it.
with speed dating mentorship. But doesn't common sense tell you that some people you're just going to get on with better than others? That's human nature. That's what people are like. So we could also make this process a little bit better if we did allow people to find out a little bit about them and see if you're a good fit for each other, and if that's match people up deliberately. Now, I don't know about your setting in if you have that process, but here it's random. It was literally very pragmatic: who's available at the school, who teaches your subjects, and who's willing to take it on. And there's no sense of trying to find a good fit for each other so that the relationship starts. Now, all relationships are effortful. And maybe that's also something else we need to change our thinking about, is relationships are not something it works or it doesn't. All relationships are effortful. Anybody who's married will know that all relationships are effortful. So you have to work at relationships. It doesn't just, it's something that happens or it doesn't. You have to work at it. However, we can make things a little bit easier if we have found people who maybe share interests, who find it easy to communicate with each other, who've got some kind of commonality. So that's the one thing. And then, what are we mentoring about? And this takes me back to this notion of well-being, and you were talking about what's taught all the way through the career. So we've been doing some research on teacher mindsets. So mindsets, in other words, do they believe that these are competencies you just have or you don't, or are they competencies you can develop? And we found that in-service and pre-service very strongly are of the opinion that social emotional competences and relational competences are things you either have or you don't. They're not skills. Social emotional skills are not perceived in service and pre-service in different contexts. It was universal. These are not things that are considered something that you learn and you can develop and you can grow. You either have it or you don't. It's like a natural thing. Now, that's problematic on a whole host of levels, but it's for me, the interesting question is, it's a bit of a chicken and an egg. Why do they believe that? Why is this such a prevalent belief? Is it how we talk socially and generally about social emotional competences and relationship building? Is that the way we talk generally? Or, which I have a strong suspicion, is it because we never teach it? My teacher training program, in service and pre-service, had nothing to do with well-being, affect, social emotional skills. It was didactics. It's what do you do in the classroom? How do you teach? What are your methodologies? How do you test? How do you give feedback? So not that those things aren't incredibly valuable, but if you don't ever teach people how to develop their social emotional skills, are you not then communicating that those skills can't be developed? Are we not inadvertently creating this mindset that if we don't teach those skills, there mustn't be skills you can learn, so you must have to either do it or you can't? Now, the misunderstanding also about mindsets is having a growth mindset about something doesn't mean everybody's going to reach the same level of competence. That's not what a growth mindset is. A growth mindset fundamentally is simply everybody can improve their abilities from where they are now. It doesn't tell you what level they'll achieve or what they'll reach. Some people will always find social emotional competencies easier than others, but everybody can fundamentally learn and improve those skills and competencies. So that's the other side for me, is how do we talk about relationship building? How do we talk about relational skills? Have we created a fixed mindset about this so that people don't even believe that it's something that they can consciously, effortfully learn and get better at? I don't know if that's taken as way off.
I'm just thinking. That's my thinking face. No, it strikes me very much from some of the what we were finding in the study, and I think generally, anecdotally, we've heard in other sessions of this idea of what happens informally versus what happens formally, and this idea also of when we in teacher education, in that Bachelor of Education, where we're teaching them how to teach, are we teaching them how to learn? And at what point, when they, in this case, in our context where there's a shortage of teachers, they come into the field and they're expected to be done learning. You're now teaching, like it's over. And so I think a lot of those informal mentorship, and I think Micah and Amanda and Cam and others who are in the room who are part of the project, I feel like some of the participants struggled with the idea of calling it informal mentorship, because it was like, it's just informal learning. Like it's relationship building and like you said, social effect of emotional relationship building with people about a topic that is important to you. And is that mentorship? Like I guess it is, but they struggled with that versus, formal mentorship top down. I think there's an acceptance that that's something different than what was happening on the informal side of things. And
It's
so,
also because we don't value that kind of informal learning, that there's no way that that's recognized or acknowledged or given
yes,
any kind of
space,
balance,
time,
space,
resources.
time,
Yeah.
or resources. Or so if we only give value, systemically speaking, to certain types of mentorship, it is automatic that people will not value the other and think it's not real and think it's not of
Yeah.
consequence. It's not something that you are giving space and acknowledgement to. So we're all back to the sort of chicken and an egg, is if we create space, how many, if I look at our formal, our teachers here can only get credit for professional development activities that are approved by the ministry. So if you go and you join an online discussion group and you do some reading, there's like a book group for teachers, and you read a book and you discuss it, and there's no space to acknowledge that as a form of professional learning. And so how, it's not to be surprised that then teachers themselves might not recognize that as learning, and might not recognize that as a valuable activity and a valuable form of relationship building, community building, identity building, and so on. So maybe we don't have structures in place that allow these informal types of learning, self-directed learning opportunities, to be recognized and to be given credence. Maybe that's also part of the issue that we're facing.
And I'm gonna say selfishly, I'm gonna ask this question, but I think it's been something that's come about in a lot of your recent work with respect to ecological systems and well-being. This idea of the system level. So I wanted to ask this question before we go to the what questions should researchers be asking piece, but it's clear that you feel we need to push from the system level as much from the individual. Well-being in particular is not an individual phenomenon, it's a system. So I would almost extend the question to you. This is like if we had the recipe, we'd do it, but I feel that you've identified that as an area to push. What does that look like in your estimation or experience, or like, how does it look to push on that level, on the system level, to get the system involved?
Oh, I've dedicated 10 years of my life to this topic, and I have made no progress on the system level, if that makes you feel any better whatsoever, or if it just makes you feel a whole lot worse. So education systems are notoriously resistant to change globally. They've been resistant to change since the 1800s. They've needed to change for about 200 years, and they haven't changed. So I have come to the understanding that we have to start in specific contexts and institutions and create good examples that can be transferred, and other people look at and say, hey, they're doing that well, that's really good, we should do that. Because trying to go to the top, to the policymakers, in my experience, has been very frustrating. You guys might have a better setup, you might have more openness from policymakers, but I have found that the most leverage I have is at the institutional level, and with leadership that is open to that, making institutional level change, and that becomes contagious. But it's also part of an ecosystem. So when a school starts doing it well, and teachers start talking about the fact that this is going well in our school, this is something that we're doing well, this is something that we've changed, the hope that that can change throughout the system is greater. Whether it will or not is another matter. I mean, it's a never-ending stream of contact and relationships. Also through things like global publishers. So the work that I've been doing with OUP particularly has given me a platform to speak to policymakers, to prompt people, to make people think, to try and trigger debate. the fact that we're having this conversation, the fact that there are researchers looking at these topics now. When we started researching teacher well-being, we started in 2016. It just wasn't a topic. Nobody was researching. It was like wasn't a topic at all. And what we were doing was considered really fringe and weird and out there. And now everybody's talking about it. Now I'm not saying, you know, but these things get momentum. So I wish it weren't the case that we have to start at a lower level, but I think realistically, that's probably where, as research groups, as individuals, as universities, as researchers, as teachers, we probably have most leverage at the institutional level. And when institutions and leadership in institutions start to take note, it can spread upwards and outwards.
And I guess I asked this question in relation to this gap in particular, because it's one that implicates individuals very, very clearly, not more than others, but it's one that juxtaposes those two. I find very interestingly, in that a lot of the research shows that change or change in FSL or making things better is most often put on the teachers, right? To go and seek out professional learning that suits them. So there's that. And that's why when in your research, I love how you were talking about specific local examples, institutional change, and also highlighting, I guess, back to this next question about what questions should researchers be asking. You're using theoretical frameworks that highlight this. So it's just like hammering home, not the how necessarily, or the like you said, the sort of difficulties and challenges, but just that we still need to keep this on the radar, right? We don't want to say that the way this is going to be solved is by individuals and then just putting it on them without an acknowledgement of the system. So that's, I guess, where I was going with that.
Yeah, that makes me rabid. Like, you know, that's guaranteed to get me out my chair and start. It's so easy, and it's a cop-out for institutions to say well-being is an individual responsibility. Go and do a yoga class, and if you're not happy, it's your problem, not our problem. And it's easy for institutions to do that, and it's easy for people who are coping in the system to say, well, I'm coping, so why are you not coping? And that just puts the onus on the individual, as opposed to saying, if one person is not coping, there's something wrong. And we don't put the onus on that. We don't always, it's just so much easier to blame an individual, because other people are, well, everybody has to suffer before it becomes an issue.
And then the person that's doing okay gets recruited as the mentor. I think back to your mentorship piece, right? The person that's slightly, and so there's this constant.
Whereas, you know, we have to be the ones to hold up a mirror to institutions for them to develop a moral compass, because they don't clearly have a moral compass on their own, and to force them to as a mirror to look at what are they doing and what are they not doing and what should they be doing more of. And I don't think that is easy in any stretch, and I haven't found successful ways of doing that I can say this is the magic recipe. And that's the nature of ecological systems.
That's right.
Every ecology is different and every context is different, and some things that may work in one setting will not work in another. But the more people are talking about these issues, about well-being, about relational issues, about experiential learning, about you see, that's a whole other topic that I think is also problematic, is because of the nature of discussions in psychology and how we talk about it, we don't value teacher knowledge in terms of what they experience. And intuition is given a bad name. You're not supposed to rely on your intuition. You've got to, you're not allowed to. If teachers have been working for 10 years, their intuition is probably pretty good. There's a lot of experiential knowledge gone into those 10 years. And, you know, we all know the statement, you can have 1 year 10 times over. Well, that's just a convenient thing to say. I think if you've been teaching for 10 years, you have probably learned a reasonable amount. And I think your intuition is also something. So when we talk about mentorship and training, and you've talked about formal and informal, we have to talk about what types of knowledge we're talking about. So not just the social emotional competences and knowledge, but what do we recognize as knowledge? And then I can go on a whole other rant about the fact that we don't recognize teacher knowledge and experiential knowledge, things that they've learned on the job. You learn things as a teacher every single day. And that's valuable knowledge too, but just because it wasn't taught in a formal way, because maybe it came through you experiencing something in your class and thinking, whoa, that work, that time with that group, and maybe I'm going to try it again with my other group. I'm going to see if that, and you don't formalize that. You might not even articulate it. Even the level of to what degree that is conscious is questionable. But does that mean it's not learning just because it doesn't conform to our conscious, explicit noticing patterns of what we think learning is?
I'm going to assume you might think that's a question researchers should be asking,
I
or maybe
really
one
do.
you're asking yourself.
Yeah, no, I do. I think we need to talk a lot more about different types of need to teacher knowledge. I think we have to be much more respectful of diverse types of teacher knowledge. We have the debate in SLA, of course, about explicit and implicit knowledge. We have all that. What about that for teachers? Where is that? Where is that whole debate about those consciousness and unconscious forms of learning, experiential forms of learning? Intuition is a massive thing for teachers. I don't know a single experienced teacher who doesn't rely on intuition. I rely on intuition, but we're not allowed to talk about that because it's not conscious and it's not explicit cognition. What nonsense! It's a huge part of being a teacher. So when we also come to talk about mentorship and training and so on, we've got to broaden out that whole discussion in what is teacher knowledge? To what extent are things explicit and implicit? How are those learned? What processes of learning are involved? So there are some conscious, very explicit processes of learning, but there are also some implicit. Then we start to talk about knowledge acquisition versus knowledge learning. That's going to open a whole can of worms. So I think that's very exciting, is to be more respectful of diverse types of learning, diverse forms of learning, and diverse forms and types of knowledge. And I think we're a long way from that. And particularly because, of course, things like intuition are laden with affect, and affect has always been seen the thing you shouldn't trust. You've got to have your cold cognition. What rubbish. If we learn anything from this artificial intelligence at the moment, we learn that cold cognition alone is never going to do it. That's not intelligence. If we want to talk about what intelligence is, on top of your cold cognition, you've got to add what they call hot cognition. You've got to add your social emotional competencies and your ability to consciously reflect and your sense of agency and so on. So if we,
I love that they're calling that hot cognition. Sorry, I just had to say
yeah,
that.
I know. That's like me in soft skills. I feel as cross about that as I do
It's Tabasco. It's good.
But we've always been taught that emotions are not to be trusted, and you've got to rationalize everything, and it's got to be this cold cognition. I don't believe that's true. I think emotions are an incredibly valuable source of knowledge. But the whole of education since time began has been trying to position cognition as like the superior form of knowing and understanding.
Yeah.
And then if you're talking about relationships, how can you talk about relationships and not talk about emotional connection?
And relationality, yeah, exactly. And including that as going back to your point about what knowledge is valued in mentorship type of situations.
What Philippa says.
Yes.
Right. Philippa, I'm a woman researching emotion and well-being. Can you imagine the stories I can tell you about that? Right. So there's that whole aspect of that as well that plays into that as well. One of the things I did want to comment about, and I think because I'm going all over the place, I'm sorry, but
we'll open it up after this.
So I have become very interested because of the ecological perspective, and this takes us back to system. And if you want to talk about where research should go, two things. One, I think we look very much at individual people and individual variables, and that's part of this sort of fragmented view. And how about looking at relationships and relationships as the unit of analysis? That is still very rare. We look at relationships between individual things, not the relationship itself as the unit of analysis. We have two things and we look at the relationship, but we look at really the two things in relation, as opposed to the relationship being the unit of analysis. That's the one thing that we become much more relational in how we conceptualize things. We talk about emotions as if they're individual things. I don't think that's true either. I think emotions function in clusters. I think you never experience just one emotion. You're always experiencing a jumble. And that's what makes it so difficult to put labels on it, because sometimes you don't know what it is that you're experiencing. It's all of this. So that's what we need to be. But our whole thinking is not relational. Our whole thinking is fragmented. What is this? I must have one word for this emotion. No, you don't. You might probably experience multiple emotions.
Or as a researcher, you need to determine the concept, like what is your operationalized concept? And it becomes,
and then it's nice and neat and belongs in a box, and that isn't, I don't think, phenomenologically how people experience things anyway. Right? So that's the relational perspective on that. But back to the systems thinking, what about the collective? So let's take just self-efficacy. So self-efficacy is like the number one variable in teachers. If you believe you can do something, you're going to have a much stronger relationship to that you do that, and so on. What about collective self-efficacy?
Yeah.
So that's a
Collective
massive
efficacy.
thing.
Yeah. And that's been determined as like a number one. I was just at a principals conference, and it's like the highest.
Right up there, right up there. But collective self-efficacy is really about the culture in a school.
Yep.
It's about how in a school there is a culture develops among the individuals, not individual people, out of these relationships and all these individuals, a culture emerges. It's very strongly determined by leadership, but not only.
No.
Then complex dynamic system. I mean, it's got it written all over it. But so what we need to understand that's going to be a huge factor for how happy people are working in that school, how happy learners are being taught in that school, learning in that school, how empowered teachers feel to make decisions, how respected they feel. So I think that collective level of, given my interest in psychological constructs, collective measures of efficacy are something that we really should be unpacking. And it's been looked at in education, but not in foreign language education, as far as I can tell. Group dynamics remains something that we haven't properly unpacked, and that's purely relational. And we struggle. If I think about my own teaching, I know that there are some groups that work well and some don't. And I still, after 30 years of teaching, cannot always pinpoint why one group works and one group doesn't. I just don't know sometimes. I just say, why is this group so brilliant and this group is so awful and they make my life a misery every week? And and that's like 30 years of teaching. So group dynamics, I would love to understand that better. And that's purely relational.
Yeah, and you're making me think of back to my other question about systems, that if we think about it as collective instead of systems, then that might be even, I mean, that's a super nerdy, like wordsmithing way, but I think conceptually it lends itself well to linking to the self-efficacy research too. If you start to think about the system level influences on the ecology, that would be interesting. Yeah. Okay, well, I'm going to stop nerding out and I'm going to open. Mike has been checking out the chat. Thank you, Sarah. That's kind of how, now that you're on the other end of it, that's how the sort of informal discussion rolls. And this is great. And we're going to keep going for the next 19 minutes, but I think I'll see what Micah, if there's any questions or whether.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to wade in and sort of open it up for everyone. What really struck me though, listening, is it's really interesting having your perspective from another continent on this, and I'm starting to see, you talk about unidirectionality and bidirectionality, and I think that's what we've been talking about in terms of informal and formal mentorship. You talk about I mean, the issue of power and culture, that's that's certainly up for us, but also I think you talked about mentorship, and I think for us it was that informal piece really links to the collaboration piece. You were talking at working it on the ground, right? And so it's just really interesting looking at across our context and thinking about the ways we are talking about, and I guess the words we are using, because words do come into it. One thing I do want to say, I think we are seeing a real push towards the holistic,
right?
On here in North America, certainly, maybe much more so than in Europe, and I think that has a lot to do with where we are in terms of indigenous resurgence that's happening right now. That is really pushing us into a certain direction. But I would really like to open it up to everyone. I know we have Cam and Amanda too, who were on the project, if they'd like to say anything, and of course anyone else who would like to wade in as well, specifically in terms of where we should be going in terms of our research.
And our thinking, of course. Yeah, sure. Nice. And it's we're a small group, so you can raise your hand and I'll pretty much say, go ahead, or you can open your mic.
I love that Daniela's commented on complexity theory.
Yes.
It has been invaluable lens for me in helping me to understand messy classrooms. Because a lot of the research, I think one of the reasons that research sometimes doesn't resonate with teachers, or certainly even doesn't resonate with me, never mind other teachers, is that sometimes I look at it and I think, yeah, but, and all I see are the problems. All I see is, yeah, this is nice, but I can see so many exceptions. I know so many ways that wouldn't work. And complexity theory for me allows me to engage with that messiness and acknowledge that things are not easy and neat and predictable in a language classroom, in any classroom, certainly not in a language classroom, and that lots of things happen together, and that there is thinking of what Stephanie was saying, there is a collective level quality that emerges from that dynamic, and the teacher is the hub of that, but there are all those relationships in the peer group as well that play into that. Thank you, Danielle. I'd love to know more about your experiences on the course and your PhD, obviously.
Yeah, I also think of unpredictability as being something that is linked to the idea of complexity theory not being something, or just admitting that things are unpredictable is like, well, you know, we that's our mission in education is to make things predictable. You make a lesson plan, this is going to happen here, next, and struggling with that. But
that's also just acknowledging that we can't always control everything, and you know, as humans we don't really like that notion that sometimes we can't, sometimes things happen out of our control. But also with complexity theory, I think we also need to be a little careful with the unpredictability thing. It's not completely random. So when we talk about complexity theory and unpredictability, you don't know exactly how it's going to go, but it's not going to go anywhere. It's going to go somewhere within a very, very broad parameter. So you can narrow it down in a sense that it's not anything goes, like literally anything goes.
yes,
there is like a sort of broad sphere, but you don't know exactly what's going to happen. You can't predict. So sometimes I think that notion of unpredictability has been rejected by people because they've taken it too literally.
Yes. And I think they swing the other way and they say, well, now we're just giving a free for all. Everybody just gets to methodologically. For my thesis, I did sort of a look at that. And I remember that being the response is just, well, let teachers do whatever they want. I mean, that's essentially what we're saying when we call a method, or even just an approach, something that is, you know, not that's stringent, or that, you know, anybody can use it however they want, that it's anyways. But I think with this, in terms of if we conceptualize relationality in this way, it really becomes messy. So
yeah, I think it also becomes tangible when we take the notion of collective. So if we say that the collective identity of a group, the collective mindset of a group, the collective motivation of a group, if you talk about them in the collective terms, then a complex dynamic system leads to emergent qualities, which are going to be those collective level qualities. So I think it is conceptually tangible when we talk about collective notions. They are the emergent qualities from whatever we're talking about as a system here that comes together and leads to those emergent qualities. So I think it can become a useful lens when you combine it that way. Perhaps I ought to stress, and maybe that is relevant to the discussions we've been having, and I know that you did the same thing, is that the reason I left complexity and went to ecological perspectives was a very deliberate move, because as I started researching well-being, it became blatantly apparent within 5 minutes that social context and social policy and social discourse was a huge part of that. And my concern with complexity theory is, in a complex dynamic system, context is part of the system. And I've talked before about how that's deeply embedded, and I like that notion. So if we're talking about identity, if we're talking about our beliefs, system is in that. Your beliefs don't come from thin air. They become from who you've been and what you've experienced and where you've lived and who you've talked to. And so context is already in. It's not external to it. So if you have a belief system, context is already in that belief system and you are experiencing it in that context. So that's why the notion of context to me in a complex dynamic system appeals, because it's not external to it, it's integrated in it. And in psychological terms, I think that's more valid and more acknowledges the temporality and the deeply embedded nature of context. However, when you're talking about well-being, I want to flag up with a big bright red flag systemic issues. So I chose to switch to an ecological perspective because I said I am worried that in the complexity perspective, structural systemic issues may become invisible, which I don't want, particularly because there's a big politics associated with this. So that's why I made the deliberate switch. And it was a very conscious choice. Sorry, Micah.
No, sorry, I just saw a question in the chat.
No, thank you very much for this. This has been a really exciting conversation. I'm wondering, just as you're mentioning the switch from complexity to the ecological theory, if you've got experience or contact with the sort of the post-human conceptualizations of complexity and the sort of looking beyond the human to other actors in those systems as well, and what your thoughts are on that.
Can you explain other actors in the system?
So sort of beings and entities, concepts, things beyond the human, so the influence of other objects, technologies,
right,
things like that.
No, but it makes sense. They're not part of the system. It's just they're not acknowledged or visible in the same way. So I can't see why they wouldn't be part of a system, but I don't have any experience with that at all. I think we're entering a very exciting phase with AI. So it's not going to go away. So we have to embrace that's part of our lives now. So we have to embrace that and understand it. And I think understanding what's happening in that space and the relationship between teachers, learners, societies, cultures, and artificial intelligences, that's going to be a very exciting set of relationships to explore. There's an interesting book. I don't remember who it's by, and it's better I say nothing rather than say who get the name wrong. And they talk about the fact that when we're looking at the future of education, that there are sort of three spaces that we need to understand. The space where AI technologies and digital worlds are better than humans. The spaces where humans are better, and the spaces where both work best in a hybrid relational combination. And I like that conceptualization. I like that. I think that's a healthy way of looking at it, because some things AI will do better. And we're back to that discussion about cold cognition, hot cognition, and so on. Humans, if you're talking about social emotional competences, humans are way and above better at that at the moment. And I'm going to say at the moment, because who knows where that's going to go. But at the moment, humans are way and beyond better at that. And that hybrid space, that hybrid intelligence, that relationship between human intelligence and competences and digital technology, otherness competences, that's if you want to talk about relational spaces, that's a very exciting relational space to explore. And to understand the emotional side of that relationship, I think will be very exciting to explore. I suspect, Cam, that had nothing to do with what you were asking me, but I'm not sure that I knew how to answer the question any other way. So you can drag me back.
Nope, that was perfect. Thank you. That's all good.
No, and I think it speaks to what you've been saying in terms of, and what if I loop it back to the research talking about the individual relational can be systems, relational can be non-human. It's meant to sort of not to take the focus completely off, but not to make it only about a one person endeavor, even though that one person is culturally influenced, obviously, and socially influenced, and as a system in and of themselves. But yeah. Pushing thinking is part of this, so I'm being silent because I'm thinking. But I
have to admit, I love indulging in conversations like this. With the best conversations are the ones where we don't have answers.
Yeah.
Because that, isn't that kind of the point? That's what we should be doing. And one of the things I regret in academia sometimes is that we have too little space for those conversations. So I'm very grateful that you didn't ask me to come here and talk about something I already know about, but to come here and think with you. Because that's an absolute luxury, because we don't have space to talk and think and just you know,
You're giving me goosebumps, Sarah. I'm going to use that quote in like everything I do, because I couldn't agree with you more. And I will give a plug to CASLT for that, because I think it's a space in terms of when we talk about research that we don't have enough as stakeholders in the field, not just the people in this room who I didn't go up to see where you're coming to this conversation in terms of your roles and so on, but I believe, and I'm sure you would too, that teachers are researchers, teachers are theorists. Like this research conversation is not isolated to people who are in an academic institution doing research. So
this is my opportunity to say, I have a very different understanding of the word research to these very narrow notions of research. My understanding of research is inquiry.
Yeah.
Thinking, looking for answers, asking questions. And there are different ways of doing that and different purposes and reasons for doing that. And so I can get quite upset about the way
passionate.
No, upset. No, let's name our emotions.
You're right.
I can get upset about the way that sometimes people talk about research as if this is, and the research practice divide, because the research practice divide is because we're using the wrong notion of research. It's a straw man argument. It's a nonsense. There are different people doing different things to understand education for different purposes from different perspectives. And whether you are in the classroom asking questions about your class and about your teaching, or whether you're a researcher asking questions about other people's classes, they are equal forms of inquiry. They're just people asking questions about education. And in my view, one is not of any more value than the other. And the fact that we talk about them sometimes in that way and label them in that way, maybe that is also sometimes contributing to this supposed gap between research and practice.
Yes.
We have a particular notion of research in mind when we talk like that, I think.
And a particular idea of where it's supposed to go in terms of coming up with answers and clear. One of the things, if you just to go back to the report, one of the things we purposefully did as a team along with CASLT was to frame the recommendations as questions. I don't know if you had a chance. I didn't pop those, and that was on purpose, because of this idea of leaving people not in the lurch, but that's what this renders, is if there was an answer, we'd all have it, right? So,
well, if we know one thing about education is we should remain curious. And if we are left with questions, we will remain curious. And there's more to know, and there's more to find out about, and there's ways for all of us to improve. If anybody thinks they've got the answer, we're kidding ourselves. Nobody has the answer. We know, and we know that's not an end point we're ever going to reach, because there will always be, there should hopefully always be more questions and more curiosity and more pathways to explore. But it's a privilege to have a space like this where you open up that space to think what those pathways might be and what's useful to think about, and invite different people from different contexts to talk and think together. I think it's a wonderful thing.
And one of the, if I can add to that, unless other people have something to say, the metric we talked about in a previous exchange, the metric of success of professional development opportunities is not just attendance, but what happens during in those spaces. And so if we're looking at metrics per se, I hate that word, but I'm putting it in quotes, of success related to initiatives to respond to a teacher shortage, I think engagement is a bad word, but just I like the efficacy piece, because it's got ways to measure it, and it's also not like, you know what I mean? Like it's variable, and it speaks very well to, I think, a collective response to the sort of thing we're seeing in Canada.
I think it's also about shared ownership of problems. And not making this one person's responsibility and ownership, but collective notions of whatever it is that you're going to. So we talk about collective well-being, and that's also something that we're not at yet. We're still looking at individual teacher well-being. So collective well-being is also something. If you want to talk about social equity issues, and you're talking about societal well-being, that's very much a collective thing. To what extent communities experience well-being? To what extent can you be thought of as flourishing if people around you are not flourishing? there's a discrepancy there. That cannot be, you know, and that's a genuine question, is to what extent can an individual be considered to have high well-being if the contexts and cultures and collectives they are part of have low well-being.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Then you are at social equity, and then you're at social justice issues, and then you are at advocacy. So I think it's about, I think when you talk about collectives, I also like the idea that there is a shared responsibility for the things that you're talking about, that it's not just an individual one-person responsibility.
And again, that's a plug for our fifth gap, which is related to shared responsibility. And shared advocacy. But I mean, I'm just saying. No, but I mean, I think it's, and everybody in this room who I've met before or engaged with, I think are all in this same space of, we all play a part, we all have a role, and one of our roles is to be in these spaces, to think and to talk and to listen, and to push our thinking in those respects, because the longer this remains an individual or researcher based or principal based or administrator based, or, you know, that we just say, well, it's on your plate, the longer this is going to perpetuate. So I appreciate you mentioning that as well, because it's certainly relevant to discussions about this topic for sure.
And I like Danielle's comment now that opportunities are the key. If a system isn't providing the opportunities, then the affordances are missing. Then
right.
that's, and then you're at a system level problem. So if the affordances are missing, a lot of will be missing. Mm-hmm. Oh, that's interesting, Sam. I'm reading that too. Well, no, that's not true. I'm not reading it yet. I've bought it, but I'm not reading it yet.
There you go.
How funny!
No
how
way.
Funny you should say that. Yeah, I bought it,
It's
but
so
I haven't read it.
good.
Let's
Right.
do a book club. I'm ready.
Yeah, that's great, Sam. I'm so glad that you said that. I've just bought it. I put it together with another book. Oh, I tell you the other one that I bought the two together. I bought this one and oh gosh, what's it called? Something like The Anxiety Generation by Jonathan Haidt.
Yes.
Okay.
That is, yes. He's been doing a lot of work on social media and young adolescents and certain, there's,
I just bought those two books together.
Those are great reads. That's good.
So Sam, tell me how you get on with that, and I'll tell you how I get on with it. It's my
absolutely sounds wonderful. Thanks.
Oh my goodness.
Also, there's another one that I'm reading at the moment that I'm really enjoying, but I've just started it, so I can't tell you too much, but it might be relevant to the conversation we're having now. It's called Cultures of Happiness. Please don't ask me the name of the author, because it's a Tibetan name, and I'm going to get it, and but it's called Cultures of Happiness, and it's a guy who was in charge of Bhutan's program of gross national happiness, and he's talking about how to upscale well-being projects from individual to collective.
Oh wow. Okay, that seems very relevant.
And I literally, it's in my living. I'm pointing that way because it's in my living room. And I've just bought it. Bye, Philippa. Thank you. I'm sorry.
Thank you. No. You're great. I think and if you're okay with it, I might even put the link to that book in the blog that we usually do with each recording.
I just started it, and it's really
I'll plug the book.
But it's relevant to this. But I haven't got further than the first couple of chapters, so I can't tell you. But it's looking promising.
Oh, there we go. Micah put it into the chat.
That's the one. Yeah, that's the one, Micah.
It's yellow.
It's yellow. That's the one. Yeah, that's the one.
Well, listen, I'm looking at the time, and I value everybody's energy and time so much that I want to make sure that people have the chance to go and do whatever they want to do. But I don't want to let everybody go without thanking Sarah immensely for your energy, your time, and of course your presence in this virtual space was wonderful. So thank you for coming to think with us and reinforce this idea that we need to think, and reading even. I mean, that's a whole other discussion of reading and thinking go together, I think, in this realm. So you've given us a lot to think about.
It was lovely to chat and think with you. It was an absolute privilege, and keep doing more of the brilliant work you're doing. It's relevant, it's interesting, it is pushing the boundaries, and I think what you're doing is absolutely fantastic. I'm really inspired and motivated by it. So thank you for inviting me to share and talk a little bit about it with you.